The division of Tanach into prakim didn't originate with Jewish scholars or with rabbis. This class surveys when, how, and why this became an accepted Jewish division, standard in almost every edition of Tanach. We will also hear the voices of those who rejected this system, and on the other hand, those who embraced it. All right, so let's begin. In the year 1818, there was a Yid by the name of Wolf Heidenheim. Wolf Heidenheim was a printer who lived in Frankfurt, and he had a famous printing press that is known as the Redelheim printing press. Many different Sfarim, Sidurim, Chumashim were printed in this press. He was known for excellence, and many of his books were very accurate as well as very beautiful. And here you're looking at the title page of a Chumash that he printed in the year 1818, or in the Hebrew in the year Tov Kuf Ayin Ches. And he worked very hard on producing this Chumash, trying to make sure to get the exact text. You know, sometimes there's different versions of a Chumash, if it's this nikud or a different nikud, if the trop's on the mil ra, if it's on mil el, if it's a psucha, or if it's a stuma, there's different these types of issues. He tried to work it all out and produce the perfect Chumash. And at the end of Parshas Vayechi, he has a note. At the end of Parshas Vayechi, he has a note, and he writes as follows. If you look at your handout number 1, he writes as follows: it's no good what the more recent printers did, who brought chulin into kodesh, who brought the mundane, who brought something that's impure, and they brought this into the domain of kodesh. So we know what kodesh is. Kodesh is the Tanach. Kodesh is the Chumash. And unfortunately, he's accusing of previous printers. We know that when you're involved in an industry, so there's a certain kanos about the other people in the industry that sometimes they're not up to it. They didn't do a good job. And he says that they failed in a certain area where they brought chayil into kodesh. What was he referring to? What he's referring to is as follows. It's a serious accusation. He's referring to as follows. Go back. Now we were in 1818, so now we're going to hit rewind. And we're going to go back to the late 1650s or the early 1660s. And there was a Tanach that was printed in Amsterdam. The title page has 2 different dates. In one place it says it's 1659. In another place it says it was 1661. This is in Amsterdam. There was a printer by the name of Yosef Atiyas. You see his name here on the title page. This is a very interesting title page for Tanach because there's different pictures connected to this week's parsha. There's a picture, a scene of Matan Torah at the top. Then there's a scene of Eliyahu on the right, and a scene of Shmuel anointing David on the left. There's a scene of Yitzchak planting on the bottom right, and a scene of Yosef on the bottom left. Anyway, but that's a side point. He printed this Tanach, and it's also a very nice, beautiful Tanach printed in Amsterdam. And at the end of Sefer Bereshis, he has the following note. And we're going to take a closer look at this note. In fact, in the Chumashim that you use today in your shul, they have this note at the end of those Chumashim. Let's have a look at the note that he has at the end over here of Parshas Vayechi. Let's make it a little bigger. You see it on the screen. So first, what he does is he tells you how many psukim. Now that we finished Sefer Bereshis, how many psukim are there in Sefer Bereshis? He gives you the number. The number is Elef Hachamesh Meyos Ushloshim Va'arba. That's the number, 1,534. And then he gives a siman. He gives a Hebrew word, and that Hebrew word is the siman. Then he tells you where is the halfway point in Sefer Bereshis, and he gives you the V'achar B'chotichya is the halfway point. Then he says, how many parshiyos do you have in Sefer Bereshis? Yud Beis, meaning Bereshis, Noach, Lecha, Vayera. You have 12 parshiyos from Bereshis through Vayechi. What's the siman for that? Zeh, Shmi La'elam. Zeh is Gematria 12. That tells us that's the siman for the number of parshiyos. Then he says the Sdarim. How many Sdarim are there in Sefer Bereshis? He says Mem Gimel. What is Sedarim? What are these 43 Sedras that we have in Sefer Bereshis? We'll return to that later. That's not Negea now. And then he gives a siman for that. Then he says, Uprakav. You want to know how many prakim? He says, Nun. And he gives a siman for the prakim. What's the siman? Hashem Chanenu Lecha Kivinu. That is the siman. The word Lecha is Gematria. The word Lecha is Gematria 50. There are 50 prakim. Then he gives you the number of psuchais. We know in the Sefer Torah there is breaks. Some of the breaks, depending on how it's written, it's called a psucha. Some of the breaks in the Sefer Torah is called a stuma. So he gives you the number. He tells you there's 43 psuchais. He tells you there is 48 stumais, And this is the text that he concludes with the Sefer Bereshis. And as I said before, most Chumashim have a note like this. He is not the first one to produce a note like this. Before the age of printing, when Chumashim were still written by hand, it was very common to have this type of note at the end of a Sefer that, ties it all together so you know exactly what happened over here. And in this derech of giving a siman, usually a pasuk, a word from a pasuk, that's the siman for the Sefer. What is unique? There's one thing that he introduced here that, as far as we can tell, never existed before in any Chumash. And that is, he gave a siman for the prakim. He gave a siman for the prakim. He said, there are 50 prakim. And he gave a siman. What is the siman? Lecha, the word lecha from the pasuk, Hashem chanenu, lecha kivinu. What's the problem with that? So go back to your handout number 2. Says our friend, what was his name? Reb Wolf Heidenheim. He says as follows. Masha Amar Khan Uprakov Nun. This that he says over here, there are 50 chapters in Sefer Bereshis. Sha'aratzen boy, what is he referring to? Al Mispar HaKapituli. He's referring here to the concept of a capital. What's the word capital? We're familiar with the word capital in Yiddish. What is the word capital? It's a Latin word. It's the same word as a capital. What's a capital? A head, right? Like the capital city, or a capital punishment, or a capital letter, right? All these things have to do with the head. So when you have a new chapter, it has a new head, it has a new beginning, so it has a new head. So this is the Latin word for this was called a capital, and so therefore a new chapter in Latin was called a capital. That's what and that's where the word capital comes from. It's what we call today a chapter. So he's saying when he says prakim, what he really means is the concept of a capital. And he's using the Latin word. Why is he using the Latin word? Because he's trying to say that it's not a Jewish thing. In no early print will you find that a printer did this type of thing, where he tried to give you a siman and make it holy, make the prakim holy. If you go back to the manuscripts, Wolf Heidenheim was a professional. He went back to old prints, he went back to manuscripts. He said there is no such a thing of the prakim is not a Jewish thing. That's why he called it chulin. It's chulin, and they were machnis chulin b'kodesh, and so therefore this is a terrible thing. By the way, in his chumash, he printed the same thing. He used the prakim, and at the end, he has a paragraph that says the number of mispara prakim and the siman. So I'm not entirely sure. On the one hand, he did it. On the other hand, he's not so happy about it. But this is the note that he has said. So this is our question for tonight: is what taka is the history over here? There's a serious accusation that's being made that the prakim come from a non-Jewish source, and he seems upset about it. At the same time, he's using it. So if this is true, so how did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen? And how should we think about this? The question becomes particularly pressing when you look at a sikha that ever from this week in Chelek Tazayin, the specific pages that we're looking at is page 229. And that's because it's a sikha that we can't get into the details. But the bottom line is there are 2 psukim in this week's parsha that talk about God communicating with the Jewish people. One says, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, and God descended onto Har Sinai. That's one pasuk. There's another pasuk that says, Kimin Hashemayim dibarti aleichem, that from heaven I spoke to you. So one pasuk sounds like God came down onto Sinai. Another pasuk sounds like God spoke from heaven. So Rashi in both places deals with this. Where is God talking from? Did he come down on Har Sinai or did he talk from heaven? And Rashi says one thing here and one thing there. And the Rebbe analyzes these 2 psukim, and the Rebbe analyzes these 2 Rashis and gives a whole sikha, a whole discussion about this. Fascinating. Toward the end, the Rebbe says that, in fact, you could connect the following. And that is, the first pasuk, the Rebbe says, is Perek Yutes, pasuk Chaf. The pasuk Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai is Perek Yutes, pasuk Chaf. The second pasuk, Kimin Hashemayim dibarti aleichem, is Perek Chaf, pasuk Yutes. The Rebbe says that's significant. Why? Because Yutes represents Shem Havaya, without getting into the B or Y. Chaf represents Keser. And so we have 2 things here. We have one, Shem Havaya is first and Keser is second. The other one, we have Keser first and Shem Havaya is second. And that matches up beautifully with what these 2 psukim are trying to do. And it matches up beautifully with what these 2 Rashis are trying to do. I don't expect you to understand what I'm saying now. If you want to learn the Sikha, you can learn the Sikha. But what's important for us is the Rebbe is making a whole Torah, a whole Lumdus, a whole taking very seriously the concept that it's chapter 19. The concept that is chapter 20. That whole division, Wolf Heidenheim just told us, is a non-Jewish division. It comes from Chulin. And the same thing when you come to the numbers of psukim. You have to remember, the number of a pasuk, the fact that every pasuk is divided, that the Gemara says is from Moshe Sinai. But to give it a number and to say it's pasuk Zayin or pasuk Vav, that depends on where you're beginning the chapter. So the number of a pasuk is also part of this same accusation, if we're going to accept it. And so therefore this is a very pressing thing for us to figure out what taka is the story over here. So let's begin our journey. You're looking here at the screen at a ksav yad, at a manuscript that is dated. We don't know exactly. It doesn't say when this page of the manuscript was written. But based on earlier pages in this manuscript that do have dates, you can assume sometime between 1490 and 1523, the page that you're looking at was written. Today, it's at a library in Zurich, in Switzerland, and it's a ksav yad. What is this ksav yad? Let's read what it has on this ksav yad. It's part of a book, and the book contains many different things. It contains a few tefillis, and it contains a few chiburim, and then you have this. These are it's called a miscellany, where people would have a book that has a whole bunch of different things that they would write into their book. What does it say over here? So turn to your handout to number 4. Let's read what it says. It will be easier to read it on the paper than to read it on the screen. It says as follows: Eilehein pirkei hagoyim. Here are the chapters of the non-Jews, hanikroin kapitulish, that are called the capitals. Shal arba ve'esrin sfarim of the 24 books. The shema is called sefer ve'sefer bil shoinam. And I'll also give you the names of how the non-Jews refer to their books: Genesis, Exodus, etc. Ve'takti me'asefer shalahem. I copied. Where am I getting this information? I copied it from their Bibles. Why? Why is it important for me to copy this, and why do we have this? So people could answer them quick answers to their questions. What questions are we referring to here? Says he, they ask us every day. They're asking us about our religion and about Yiddishkeit and about Torah. And they bring evidence from supposed evidence from the Torah, and from the Nevi'im, from other books. And they always say, they cite chapter and verse. Look at this verse, Shehu b'Sefer Pliny, which is in this book. B'kach v'kach kapitalish me'asefer, and this capital. We don't know these chapters system, and so how are we supposed to check up the psukim? So if you want to be able to answer them, if earlier in the work the guy told you, by the way, if you read Isaiah 53, it says as follows. So you come home, you want to come to work tomorrow and give him an answer. How are you going to find Isaiah 53? So in order to give them a quick answer, and therefore I made them here. Sefer Bereshis. So now he says Sefer Bereshis Nikra Bol Shainam. What is it called in their language? It's called Genesis. He writes Janisi. And he writes it with Nekudis. And then you have an entire list. See, on the right-hand side of the screen, it says Perek Aleph Bereshis Bar Lekim. And then you have under Vaychul Hashmayim V'Aretz. That's chapter 2. Then it says Beis. V'Anochash Haya Arum Gimel. That's chapter 3. And here you have a listing of the entire Tanach. Now, if we just looked at this, we would say, okay, so there was a Jew sometime in the 1490s or the early 1500s who sat down, he had some blank pages, decided to write this for himself. So it's one person in one time. Well, look at this ksav yad. Here you have in Paris, in the National Library in Paris, another ksav yad dated to around the same time, late 1400s, early 1500s. And as you can tell by looking at the screen, you're looking also at a list. But before the list, there's words. Let's look at the words. Look on your handout on number 5. Look what it says in Ksav Yad, Hebrew 6263 in Paris. Shoyam lanu b'chol yom. They ask us every day al inyan amunoseinu v'tereseinu akdosha, about our religion. Umeviim rais mipsukei Torah. They bring evidence from the Nevi'im and from other books. V'omer lanu, when they say re'eva kara b'pasuk pleni shu b'sefer pleni. Look at this verse in this book. V'kafa. What do you notice over here? It's the exact same language that we saw in the Zurich manuscript, we see in the Paris manuscript. There are some differences in the words, as is to be expected when people are copying. There's some variations in the text, but you're able to tell, all of a sudden we realize, we're not looking at one person who wrote something into his book. There looks like there was a chibur, there was some sort of concept that existed in the late 1400s, and multiple people were copying this. Here, let me show you the ending of the list. Here the list ends, and then there's a few lines. What does it say in these 3 lines at the end of the list? So go back to your sheet on number 5, second paragraph. Oid yesh lahem sefer echad nikra Maccabees. Once I'm telling you about the Christian Bible, let me let you know they have a book that's called Maccabees, which is true. The Catholic Bible has that book. V'hu, what you want to know what it is? I'm telling you, fellow Jew. V'hu Megillah Antiochus. This is Megillah Antiochus. Megillah Antiochus is in the Sidurim. There's this old text that says the story of Hanukkah. So he says it's the same thing. Whether it's the same thing different, that's not our subject for today. But it's just interesting that you have that line there. Then look at the next paragraph. It says, Nishlamu Pirkei Hagoyim, Mikol Esem Rabba. I finished the work. The book is finished. I finished. And again, what's he calling it? Pirkei Hagoyim. He's calling it, it's almost like the name of the book was called Pirkei Hagoyim, the chapters of the non-Jew. I finished. And we copied it. And again, he tells you at the end, why? So that we could answer all of their questions. By the way, there's a third ksav. This is not readily available because the University Library at Cambridge does not make it available. But in their catalog, they have a description of a ksav that has the exact same words. So there's at least 3 different kisvei yad in different libraries around the world that have pretty much the exact same thing. What the chiddush in this one in Cambridge is that it actually has a name of the person who wrote this. It says that the Baal HaMechaber of this kunteris, his name was some Reb Shlomo ben Yishmael. So basically, we're just looking at this, we're able to see, because first of all, if you came to Jews in the 1400s, we see that there was this concept of, there's Pirkei HaGoyim, there's a way they divide the Bible, and it seems this is the first evidence of where Jews are starting to say, by the way, it's important for us to know about that. And so therefore, there's going to be a work that's going to be disseminated. You could imagine there were many more copies of this, but then it kind of fell away and became useless. And why? Why was this important for people to have? It seems that this was important, at least what they were saying was, it's important for you to have this because of the fact that there are forced conversations that we need to have, whether it's forced or not forced, with non-Jews on theological matters. They're quoting chapter and verse, and so therefore we need to be familiar with their system. During this same period of time, we have another example that's similar but different. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're able to see a beautiful page of Bereshis. That is a Tanach that has art surrounding in the margins, it's surrounding the Chumash. This is a Ksav Yad. The Ksav Yad of the Chumash was written sometime in the 1300s in Spain. Toward the end of the book, you have the following listing that you see at the end of the screen. This was probably added later. But the assumption is, same tkufa, sometime around the late 1400s, early 1500s is when this list was added. And what does it say? It says, kapitalish, me arba ve'esen lecheshben hagoyim. It's the way they count. They count, and here I'm going to tell you. Now, he doesn't say why you need to know this information, but he's clearly identifying as a non-Jewish thing, and so you have that identification as it being a non-Jewish idea that is presented at the back of a book. All of this is only in manuscript. And then we get where this same idea trickles down into the area of print. Why? Fast forward, in the year 1524, there was a book that was printed in Venice by the famous printer whose name was Daniel Bomberg. We're going to mention his name a few times during this shiur. He was not Jewish, and he was the only one during this tkufa, this decade of the 1520s, was able to print Sfarim in Venice. Jews were not able to print Sfarim. He was able to print Sfarim, and he cornered the Jewish market, and he would print books for them. And so his name is always prominently displayed on the title pages. What is this sefer that was printed by Daniel Bomberg's press in 1524? It is a biblical concordance. What's a biblical concordance? The best way is to just look yourself. Here, I'm opening one of the pages of the concordance for you to see what does it look like inside. So, for example, here we see the word beged. I want to know the word beged. Where does it appear in Tanach? And I want to know the word beged. I also want to know the word bigadim. And I want to know bigdai. And all the variations of the word beged. So what does he do here? You open up the concordance to Beis, and in Beis you go to Beis Gimel, like you would do in a dictionary, and you have a listing here of beged. Look on the left-hand side of the page of all the times you have any word related to beged, and how is it assigned? How do you find it? Where do you tell? Chapter and verse. First it gives you the parak, and then it gives you the pasuk. On the right-hand side you have letters from Ois Aleph, whether it's etein and avneit and achashtar patnim and achashtarnim, those hard words from Megillas Esther, and this is the biblical concordance. This is the first biblical concordance that was printed 1524 in Venice. However, though it was printed in 1524, it was actually written somewhat earlier. Here is the introduction, and you see the name Vani Yitzchak Nassen. He's the one who is authoring this biblical concordance, and he gives here the dates of when he wrote it. And he gives Jewish dates and not Jewish dates, and so it's again, they don't match up perfectly. It starts off in 1437 when he's writing it. It takes a long time to produce something like this. And it concluded, depending on how you count, either in 1448 or in 1445. Either way, it took him a number of years to produce this. So it's the same tkufa that we're talking about. This is the mid-1400s, where someone is writing a biblical concordance. Now, we need to know, why did he write a biblical concordance? So on this page over here that you see on the screen, he writes why he's doing this. Let's read what he has to say in the sheets. So now go back to the sheets and we're going to read number 6. So he writes as follows. Yitzchok Nosson, that's the name we're going to call him by. So he goes like this. Every day I had interactions with the wise non-Jews, the Christians. Although I want to stay far away from religious disputation, nonetheless I couldn't. They insisted that I answer. Okay, so I had no choice. I was involved in religious disputation. I found amongst their books, Sefer Echad, a book, that they call Concordancias. They call a concordance. Me ha-Biblia, from the Bible, a biblical concordance. And with that book, there was no argument that I couldn't overcome when you have a biblical concordance. Why? You're arguing Tanach. If I have a biblical concordance and I know how to find psukim, I know how to find words, I was able to overcome any argument they threw at me. Therefore, chamadativ, I wanted it. Ahavtiv, I loved it. Achastiv, I held on to it. I brought it into in other words, he bought his own copy of the biblical concordance. So I thought, okay, let's translate this thing. The work was already done. All you need to do is translate it from Latin, which is what it was written, into Hebrew. However, I changed my mind. I gave up on doing it. I realized that translating from the Latin into the Hebrew is not going to be effective whatsoever. Why? So he gives an example here of the word mechoikek. Let's say you want to find the word mechoikek. So you would open up, if it's a Hebrew biblical concordance, you would open up the word mem ches, and you find the word mechoikek, and from there you then go find every time it's in the Torah. In Latin, however, what did the Latin translator of the Bible, what did he do? Sometimes he translated, every time you're translating, there's an element of commentary. Sometimes when you're translating, it made sense to say that mechoikek here, in this pasuk, refers to a wise person. So he wrote wise. And another time, it makes sense to say that it's a navi, it's a prophet. So he translated as a prophet. And sometimes it's a ruler, and so he translated it as a ruler. So therefore, it's in the Latin concordance, it's under ruler. And one mention is under ruler, one mention is under chacham, one mention is under navi. Okay, that's not the seder. If I want to find all the words mechekek, it's not going to work to translate it back from the Latin into the Hebrew. And so therefore, another famous example, he doesn't mention this. Another famous example is the word virgin. So by then they have the word virgin, and so all the words psula are under that listing of virgin, as well as the word alma, which they translate as virgin as well, is also going to be under that in the same category. In a Hebrew biblical concordance, it belongs on two separate entries, one under alma, one under psula. So that would be another example of where this would be wrong. And so therefore he realized, forget it, there's no purpose in translating it. But you can understand, to write a biblical concordance, you imagine the amount of work this is. It's a tremendous painstaking, go through word by word by word. See, I have no choice. So I decided that I am going to produce it in our language. By the way, I didn't mention, where is he living? He's living in Provence. That's generally he writes clearly that this is where he lives, and we know from other places. Other Chacham, the Abarbanel mentions him in his Sfarim, like that he knows this Yitzchok Nosson. Anyway, now here's a key line. I didn't want to leave his model, the Christian Bible's model, the Yekal Limtzoik Kol Pasuk Nidirsheo B'Shtei Alashonos. Because why? Because I wanted to make it easy for you to find every pasuk in both languages. And therefore, Rishamti Kol Esem Rabbah Lemisbar Parshias Anoitzim. So therefore, how did I make my concordance? I needed to send you to a perek and a pasuk. I need to send you to a place. So how am I going to do it? Like theoretically, you could have written Parshas Bereshis, the 120th pasuk in Parshas Bereshis, right? That also could have been a system. But he's like, no, I want to give you the same system that when you're talking to Christians, you're working within the same thing. And also you could check it up in both. You could check it up in this Tanach, you could check it up in their Tanach. And so therefore, I didn't leave his model, and I created this biblical concordance, which he's making for Jews. This is very important. He's making this for Jews, but he's using their chapter and verse system. So notice the parallel between this and all the manuscripts I was showing you before. The manuscripts I was showing you before, which seems that there was this work that was written, that was called Pirkei Agoyim, that was people were copying in their manuscripts. Why? What was the argument? That this was needed in order to debate Christians. What are you seeing here? You're seeing here that he's saying that he's having the same type of experience himself, which is why he felt this book was useful, and he said that he's going to use the same system. Why is he using the same system? It sounds like he's saying because for the same purpose, for debate, for dialogue, for those disputations that we are having with him. Okay, on the left-hand side, having with them. On the left-hand side of your screen, he realizes that for Jews, this is a whole new system. So let me tell you how it works. So he gives a listing of every perek, where the perek starts, and how many psukim are in that perek. So you see Bereshis, and then Shmois, and Vayikra, and Bamidbar. Again, he's saying the number, again, he's saying here where each perek starts and how many psukim are in the perek. After he's finished the whole thing, he decides, and I don't fully understand why, he decides he needs to talk about this again, a second time. So you see, he finished his whole work, he told you all the prakim, he finished saying Chag Escharya Malachi, and now he writes another note. Let's read number 7 to see what he says, or you could look at the screen on the left-hand side. He says as follows. Listen to this. Matzasi kasuv ba'atakas hanoitzris nechlak leila parshias kimisparam kimishpatam. I found this chapter and verse system in the non-Jewish Bible. And it's unanimous. There's no differences. It's not like they have different systems. They all use the exact same system. They all agree. Each neder with no exception. And therefore, and that's why I chose to use it in my book. And I didn't use our own parshiyos. What does he mean? I didn't use my own parshiyos. So you'll see in a second, because he says, why didn't I use our own parshiyos? Because la flogas chiluf hadeyos. Because there's so much difference of opinion about psuchos and stumas. In other words, he had a havamina here. What was his havamina here? Every time you have a break in the Torah, whether it's a psucha or a stuma, you could count that as a chapter. You could count that as a chapter. Now, it would be funny. Why? Because in Aseres HaDibros, you have 2 words, and then you have a psucha or a stuma, and you have sometimes a psucha stuma in the middle of a pasuk. And sometimes it's just 2 psukim, 3 psukim. Okay, but those are the exceptions. For the most part, you have, it's like a chapter. Another problem would be a parsha like Vayetze, a parsha like Miketz. You have a long parsha, and there's no psucha stuma in the whole parsha, not in the whole Vayetze or the whole Miketz. So you'd end up having a very unbalanced system. But that was the idea that he was thinking about, that he was considering. Maybe we should do it. Why did he say we're not going to do it? So he says because there's difference of opinion how to do psuchas and stumas. So in Torah, in the 5 books, there is difference of opinion. There is difference of opinion, but there most of the difference of opinion is whether it's a psucha or a stuma. But that there is a gap, that I'm pretty sure, I'm not an expert in this at all, but I'm pretty sure there's unanimity that there is a gap. But the shaila is more in Nevi'im and Ksuvim. That taka is a shaila. Where do you put the gaps? Because not so negel, Allah lamaisa, because not. So how are you going to do it? Remember, he needs to do a chapter and verse system for the whole Tanach. And he says that if you look in different Kisrei Yad, you see, how are you doing a psuchas and stumas and Shmuel and Melachim and this and that? He says there's too much difference of opinion, and so therefore I couldn't use that system. So what was I left with? And it's not like you could say you do Parshas HaShavua, because that doesn't work for Yeshua, that doesn't work for Shoftim. So he realized, I don't have a system. I don't have Parshas HaShavua. I don't have psuchas and stumas, so therefore I use chapter and verse. Now what's interesting is, earlier he didn't say this reason. Earlier he said a different reason. He said that it sounded like he was saying, the reason why I use this is because I want you to be able to toggle back and forth between both Bibles, between the Jewish one, between the non-Jewish one. Here he's giving a different reason. Then he adds as a second reason. Here he says, "Uveyichud, especially leman yekal chipus hapsukim b'mkaimasam b'daber banu anoitzri," so that it is easy for us to find psukim when the Christian says, look at Isaiah 53. I know how to pick up. I know how to find it very quickly using my own biblical concordance, etc. And therefore, that is how Oh, here he says an interesting thing. He says, by the way, I use their system on all my books. I wrote, basically what he's saying is, he went home, he took all his Tanachs, and on the margins of his Tanakh, he wrote in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and he did it. And he ends off here saying, and if you like this idea, and if you find success in it, do the same thing. Go home, and so here we have an advocate where he's saying, go home, take your Tanakh off the shelf, and add this chapter and verse system in, because it's going to be good. Why is it going to be good? So he seems to be saying the main reason is so that you can have that conversation with Christians. Okay, that's what he's saying. Okay. Adkan benegea, what we have over here. So we'll do the questions at the end. So let's just wrap up. This is the first section. What do you have in the first section? What do we see? We saw that there is dialogue. There is some sort of disputation between Jews and Christians, and because of that, there is a need for Jews to know the chapter and verse system that they have, and as a result, in Kisvei Yad, we have people writing up what their system is in different various manuscripts, and there was a work that existed that was going around. And then during that same tkufa, in the 1400s, it was printed in the 1500s, but in the 1430s or so, this monumental biblical concordance is put together, and he writes that the reason he's going to use their chapter and verse system is for the same reason for that dialogue. And he also mentions along the way that, by the way, I didn't have an alternative system. There was nothing else that I could have used that would have worked for all of Tanakh. Let's move our story forward and see how this transfers over into standard Sfarim. So where does that happen? How does that happen? So you're looking now at the title page of a Tanakh that was printed by the same Daniel Bomberg. This is the first Jewish book that he printed, as far as I know, in the year 1518. And this was a pirush, as you can see in the title page, Arba ve'Esrim. This is going to be the whole Tanakh that he's going to print. And here is a listing, it's a little closer up of the title page of the different Mefarshim that he has. He printed this, like Chumash, for example, it's Chumash, Targum, and Pirush Rashi. And the Nevi'im, he has other commentators. Here is the inside of this Torah. And what you can see, it's on the right-hand side, meaning look at the image on the left-hand side. You have the text of the Torah. To the left, you have the Targum Onkelos. Under that, you have Rashi. And now I'm blowing up over here. I'm blowing up the text of the Torah. And you can see right next to Vayechulu Hashamayim V'aretz V'chol Tzva'am, on the right-hand side, you can see a base. You can see a base. And that's telling you that chapter 2, which is where Perek Beis begins in Tanakh, begins after Vayera Vayibeka Yom Hashishi, you have a base. This is a book, a Chumash. It has Rashi in it. It has Targum in it. Presumably, it's printed for the Jewish community. And you have here, this is the first, so to speak, real grand entrance, because I wouldn't call the concordance the grand entrance. This is the grand entrance of where we have this chapter system that comes into the Torah. I should point out that this page that you're looking at right now, I took this image it's from the Rebbe Rashab's library that's in Russia. The Rebbe Rashab's library in Russia, he had a copy of this Tanakh that was printed in 1518, very, very valuable. And the Russians still have it, but they put some images online, and that's where I took these images from. Bomberg printed 2 editions of this Tanakh that year. The first one that you just saw had Onkelos and had Rashi. What if you just wanted the text of the Torah? So he printed another edition in the same year that just had the text of the Torah. And here too, you can see on the bottom right, by Vayechulu Hashamayim, there's a beis in the margin, and on the bottom left, there's a gimel, V'anochash Haya Arum, the beginning for chapter 3. This is the Tanakh of 1518. Okay, now we move to Sefer Shmuel. Sefer Shmuel, in the same Tanakh, in the same edition of Tanakh, there's something interesting in Sefer Shmuel. Till now, we were talking about the Prakim, but there's another related topic, and that is, today when we refer to Sefer Shmuel, Sefer Malachim, and Divrei Yamim, we refer to Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Beis. Divrei Yamim Aleph, Divrei Yamim Beis. Or as the non-Jews would say it, 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel. 1 Kings and 2 Kings. So here, when it's in Sefer Shmuel, look at the note that they wrote in the Sefer. It says as follows. Kan maschilim haloyazim. This is where the loyazim, this is the reference to non-Jews, calling them loyazim, the people who speak the colloquial language. Here is where they start Sefer Sheni Shal Shmuel. They start Shmuel Beis over here. They start Shmuel Beis over here. In other words, this is new. they know for the Jewish audience this is going to be a new thing. It's interesting. There is no ha'ara about the chapter system. They just put it in. They didn't say anything. They didn't really need to say anything. But here they did make, the Prakim are going to start all over now. There's going to be an Aleph now, the first chapter of Shmuel Beis. So the Jewish reader is going to be a little surprised. So they put a note, Kan Maschilim Aloyazim, Sefer Sheni, Shal Shmuel. This is where the second book of Shmuel begins, and that's why the chapters are going to start again. By the way, the note continues and says, this is Sheni Shal Malachim Etzlam. They actually call it Second Kings. What's Pshat? It's not the way it works today. But Amo, what the Christians did is that the books of Shmuel and Malachim, they counted as one book. Why? Because all talking about kings, Shaul and David, and so it was all one thing. So they had First Kings, Second Kings, Third Kings, and Fourth Kings, which was the books of Shmuel and Malachim. So it's saying over here, this is where they begin the second book of Shmuel, which actually is Second Kings. Okay, then it fell out of favor and they stopped using that system, but that's what he's referring to over here. Moving right along, we are now in the year 1523, 5 years later, and we have a sefer that's printed. It's a diktuk sefer, also printed in the same place by Bamberg's printing press. Notice so far that all of the uses of this chapter and verse system, whether it's the biblical concordance in terms of printing it, and the Tanach, the two editions of the Tanach, Daniel Bamberg in Venice. Here you have a sefer, a diktuk, that was written by a Rav. His name was Avram Dablamosh, something like that. The title of the sefer is Mikneh Avram. It's printed in the year 1523. And he actually has an interesting Akdama over here where he writes about Daniel Bamberg, which is very normal. They would praise him and they say how great of a person he was. And they obviously, they were for understandable reasons, they were explaining how great of an individual he was. But one of the interesting pieces of information over here is, he writes, Af hu lamad sefer v'loshen Yehudis, referring to Bamberg, that he learned Svarim, he learned Hebrew. So in other words, it's not like you're dealing here with an Am Haaretz who didn't know anything. He was a scholar, he was a businessman, probably a businessman first, but he was somewhat familiar with Jewish works and Jewish books and the Jewish language. Anyway, in this book, he is talking about diktuk. But along the way, look what he'll write over here. In the third line, the end, he writes, Kamosha Kasu beBreishis, as it says in Breishis, Simin Beis, chapter 2, Lefi Aroimim. According to the Romans, which means according to, in the Latin Bible, referring to the Romans. So and throughout the Sefer he does this. He refers to the chapter system, but as you can tell, the first time he does it, and a few other times in the Sefer, he's letting you know, by the way, this is not Jewish. He knows that the reader in 1523 is going to be looking at this and finding it weird, and so he tells you, by the way, it's Lefi Aroimim. Okay, but the main shift that had the most influence comes a year later, in the year 1524. Because that's when Daniel Bamberg printed a new edition of the Chumash. And unlike last time, now he gets a scholar involved, a Rav, so to speak. I don't know if he was an actual Rav, but someone who could have been a Rav involved in the production of this Chumash, and he invests a tremendous amount of effort in producing this and in making it. His name is Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim. And you can see over here on the left-hand side of the page, this Yaakov ben Chaim has a long introduction, and he tells you exactly how he made this Chumash, and all the work that went into the creation of this Chumash, the whole science of this work. You can tell he put an immense amount of effort in here. Sadly, we know from other sources, as is Yaakov ben Chaim, not now, not in 1524, but about a decade or so later, actually converted to Christianity. Okay, but right now he's a kosher yid, as far as we're able to tell. And he's he's involved in the production of this Tanach, and we're going to read parts of his introduction. And let's go back. Let's go now back to the source sheet that you have, and look at source number 8, where this Yaakov ben Chaim writes. So the first thing he writes is, by the way, if not for the concordance, which was written about 40 years earlier. He's dating the concordance to about the year 1480, written by Rabbi Yitzchak Nassan, and we already printed it here in Venice, right? Remember, they printed it in Venice a year around that time. I think it was the same year. If I didn't have it, I would have no way been able to been doing the work of Hago uvil adai ein derech la'ayin b'Mesiris. The work of Mesiris you can't do. What does he mean here with the work of Mesiris? The work of the Mesiris the work of the Mesiris is, if you want to know how to spell a certain word in the Torah, is it malay or is it chaser? One of the aleph bays is you need to know, well, what are all the other times that it's written in the Torah? And how is it spelled elsewhere? Not that that's going to be the final say, but you definitely need to do that. And that's why in old Tanakh, going back hundreds of years, there were these notes along those, there was these notes in the margins. I would say, by the way, this word, it appears 7 times in the Torah. It appears 8 times in the Torah, spelled this way. And like this, by keeping cheshbon, you know, so 7 times it's spelled, the word is spelled without a vav. 8 times it's spelled with a vav. And just by keeping track of these types of things, you're able to know how to write the Tanakh with the right nusach. So he wanted to work on this and to produce the best Tanakh that has no flaws whatsoever. So he's like, this concordance was machaya. I was able to check things up very, very easily. Okay, so far, you want to use for your research in your printing house, you want to use that? God bless you, use whatever you want. So that's not really a chiddush. But the chiddush becomes in the next paragraph. Because now he's going to tell you why he uses the chapter and verse system in the Chumash that he actually printed. Look what he writes. He writes, if I would just say, by the way, you could find this in the book of Yeshua, in the book of Shoftim, so then that would be a great loss. No one would ever be able to find anything. And someone who's trying to study this would give up. I had to use the division of the parshas that was brought by Rabbi Yitzchak Nassin in this concordance. What is he referring to? So go to the end. This Tanakh came out in 3 volumes. Let's turn all the way to the end of the 3rd volume. And what he does over here is he tells you like this. I'm going to help you. I want to, let's take the word avoisav la avoisav. Let's take the word avoisav. So he says over here, avoisav, if you want to know where you can find references to where you can find all the avoisav in Tanakh. So if you go to Sefer Shoftim, Siman Beis, and Tehillim, Siman Mem Tes, so on the side of the Tanakh over there, I have the information about those words, where you could find all the avoisavs and where you could find all the avoisavs in these 2 places. Okay, so he's using here. He wants to give you an exact location, and he sent you to Taka, to Shoftim, Siman Beis, and to Tehillim, Siman Mem Tes. And as you can see, he's doing that throughout this list. So his point is, I wanted to give an exact maramakim. If I didn't have chapters, what would I say? Shoftim what? Shoftim again. Stuck. I'm going to say for Shoftim. So he's using it internally. In the Chumash itself, in the Tanakh itself, he doesn't use it that much. Once in a while he uses it. But at the end, when he's giving you a listing of all the words and where you could find the simanim for all of these words, there he does use it in abundance. And this is what his point is. His point was, I needed a system. This is the only system that I saw available. So number one, I used the concordance for my own research. That's great. But in terms of why I put it in the Tanakh, it's because this is very, very useful in order to find things. And that's why, similar to what was done in 1518, where it was actually in the Tanakh, he also had it along the way in the text of the Tanakh. He presented this same system. Then he says something really interesting. Look at the next paragraph. Had I found a division of the portions in the Torah that's from our tradition, I would have preferred to use that over anything else. But I didn't have anything. Now look what he says. But then I got, after I already almost finished all my work, I got it. I found it. I found the thing that was what? From the Baalei Mesorah, their division. In other words, he seems to have believed that just like the Christians made a division because it was useful, there must have been at some point in history when Jews made a division that would also somehow be useful. He just says, I didn't have it. But then, close to printing, I got it. So therefore, Amarti lat pisa gami. So you know what? I'm going to stick it in my book. So I didn't use it for cross-referencing. I didn't use it, but I'm going to present it. And so here you have in his Sefer, you have the following. On the right-hand side, he's doing chapters. He's telling you, here's the beginning of each chapter and how many verses are in each chapter. That's what's happening on the right-hand side of your screen. The left-hand side of the screen, look what it says. Elaine Sidrei HaTorah Al Pi HaMesorah. This is a traditional breakdown of the Torah. Bereshis has Mem Gimel, right? So chapters, how many chapters Bereshis has, we already know from earlier, it has 50. Here he has a Jewish chapter system that is 43 and Shmois, and he tells you where each, we'll call it Sedra, because that's the word he uses here, we'll call it Sedra, where each Sedra starts. So what's going on over here? What is he referring to? What was this lost Messiah of a Jewish chapter system that he says that he found? So, and why didn't he have it? And why did it appear to him late in the game? So the answer is going to come to us from going back to your handout and have a look at number 9. Number 9 comes from the travels of Rabbi Binyamin of Tedela. We spoke about Rabbi Binyamin of Tedela in the class on the Nile, on the river. So he went to Egypt and he described the Nile. He lived in the 1100s. He comes from an area in Navarre, which is north of Spain. He traveled around the world. He wrote a travel log. This was a bestseller. He writes as follows. He's describing what happened in Mitzrayim. He says, Visham in Egypt, Shnei Bate Knesses, the Jews have 2 different shuls. Achas la'anche Eretz Yisrael. One is for Jews who came from Israel. Va'achas la'anche Eretz Bavel. Others are Jews who came from Bavel. Ve'ena noegin kulam minhag echad. They don't have the same custom. The Parshias uvistarim shal Torah when it comes to dividing the Torah portion for the week. What's the difference? Ki anshe Bavel, the Jews who are in Egypt, who emigrated from Bavel, hey, they noyagin likreis b'chol shavua parsha kamosh oisim b'sfar. They do it the way it's done in Spain. Uchamina genu shanu noyagin, which is what we do. Rabbi Binyamin Tedela is telling his audience, which is b'chol shana v'shana mesaymin as a Torah. Every year they finish the Torah. Ba'anshe Eretz Yisrael, however, the Jews who were in Israel and they came to live in Mitzrayim, einam noyagin kach. They don't divide the Torah in this way. Aval oisim ekol parsha gimel starim. Every portion is divided into 3. And notice he uses the word starim. In other words, parsha is Arminic, that's parsha, which comes from Bavel. The Jews were influenced by Bavel. And then there's sedra. Sedra, what's the sedra? The sedra is the Jews who have a slower division. They go through the Torah over 3 years. Okay, so this is, and the emesis we have in the Rambam, in Hilchas Tefillah, Perek Yud Gimel, Halacha Aleph. Look at the Rambam right. Haminig HaPashut B'chol Yisrael. When he says Minig HaPashut, he doesn't mean simple. Minig HaPashut means it's spread out. So the common custom is you finish the Torah b'shana achas. V'yesh misha mashlim. The Rambam writing in the late 1100s is saying there are some Jews, because he knew them, they were in Mitzrayim, and in Eretz Yisrael, who finish every 3 years. This is not a common custom, but it is a custom that exists. And by the way, the Talmud Bavli references the fact that there is this difference between the way it is done in Bavel and the way it is done in Eretz Yisrael. By the way, if you go back to Rabbi Binyamin, what he says is something very interesting. He says there's a minig and a takana in Mitzrayim that both communities daven together on Simchas Torah and on Shavuos. So it's interesting. Because what's the result of that? The result of that is that even the people who didn't finish the Torah every year, they still went to the Kiddush on Simchas Torah. And they still were there. They were saying L'chaim, and they were dancing, and they were having all the fun because they were part Simchas Torah. They celebrated together. It's a very interesting chap. It's an interesting idea. Simchas Torah is not, even if you didn't finish the Torah, it's not about your siyum. Am Yisrael is happy, or part of Am Yisrael is happy. So everyone joined. That's a very, very beautiful, a very beautiful idea, a very beautiful concept. Anyway. This is what he's referring to. And the numbers match up. He said that he had 43 Sdarim in Sefer Bereshis. Yeah. So we know this. We know this from the research that was done about how this system, Minig Eretz Yisrael, was done. The Taka was broken up. It's not exact. There's different, it's not like it was one Minig. There's actually different ways of doing it. But one of the breakdowns is that it was Taka broken down into Mem Gimel. This Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim, this Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim, he got this. I don't know if he knew exactly what it was. He seems to have thought that this was a way of just doing prakim, chapter and verse, it seems. And he's like, oh, such a chaval. Had I known, I would have used it. Why didn't he know? Because why would a Jew in Italy have this information? No one in Italy was doing the 3-year system. So Jews in Italy didn't know about this. Jews in Spain didn't know about this. Jews in France didn't know about it. Which is why Rabbi Binyamin, remember, he wants to write new information to people. That's why he puts it into his travel and say, by the way, there's a Greise Chiddush that people in Mitzrayim do it this way. It was novelty, so they didn't know. It happens to be that he was doing. Everyone knew he's collecting Kisvei Yad, this Yaakov ben Chaim, because everyone knew his research. So someone dropped on him Oksav Yad, and he saw a new listing. I don't know if he knew exactly what the purpose. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he didn't know. He doesn't show that he knows. That is for sure. He seems to be saying, I could have done this as a chapter and verse system. But Koppel, it was never there as a chapter and verse system. It was never there to make it easier to find psukim. It was there, Pashuk, because it was a different minig. Now, it would have been very interesting. What would have happened if he would have got this earlier and he would have made a Yiddish chapter and verse system? Very important. Kala, now all of this is going to get the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. What about Nevi'im and Ksuvim? So the answer is that they also had a system for there, and it's not entirely clear why. In other words, the same Kisvei Yad that tell you how to break up the Torah into a 3-year division, there's also, it tells you how to break up Yeshua, Shaftim, Malachim. There's a system over there. And there's a lot of speculation. Why? Was it because they tried learning it in a certain Meshach Zman? It doesn't, I don't want to get into it because I don't know. I don't think anyone has a definitive answer. But it was there. So imagine if he would have had that a few months earlier and he would have used it. It could be, history would have been different. But Paul, he didn't. So he put it into the Sefer. He put it in over here that people should know about it. And this is what's called the Sidrei HaTorah. You may remember in the beginning I showed you that at the end of the Chumash it says how many Sdorim there are in Bereshis. It says how many parashas. It's 12 parashas. It says the number of Sdorim. Now you know what it is. Now you know what the Sdorim. Now you know what the Sdorim are. Now I want to say something interesting about this system of the chapter and the verses that he put in. This Yaakov ben Chaim put in. I'm showing you here the beginning of Malachim Aleph. Beginning of Malachim Aleph. And you have over here the beginning of Perek Gimel. On the left-hand side, it says, Vayischaten Shloima as Paroi Melech Mitzrayim. Shloima made a shidduch with the family of Paroi Melech Mitzrayim. If you open up your Navi today at home, you'll see that that's where Perek Gimel begins. Vayischaten Shloima as Paroi Melech Mitzrayim. However, look over here. There is no Gimel indicating that that's the beginning of chapter 3. Instead, where do you have Gimel? On the earlier page, there's a pasuk that ends with the words "Va'amamlocha nachoina b'yad Shloima," and the melucha was established and strong in the hands of Shloima, and the Gimel is over there. Okay, so you may look at it and say, okay, so instead of putting the Gimel at the beginning of chapter 3, put it at the end of 2. It's some sort of typo, and that's it. However, it's nicht azay pasha. Why? Because look over here. This is, remember, in the beginning of the book, he gives you a list of the beginning of each perek. Look what he has over here. Malachim Aleph, Perek Aleph, he gives you the words. Perek Beis, he gives you the words. Perek Gimel, what are the words? The last words, and this is the only place where he's doing that. I shouldn't say the only, but one of the only places where he does that, where he brings everything. V'amelech David Zaken is the first words. Vayikru v'yumei David Lamos is the first words of Perek Beis. All of a sudden here, Gimel, we're getting the last words of Perek Beis. Okay. Well, the truth is, we know that he used the concordance from Yitzchak Nassim. We know that the whole time he's saying that he used it all the time. So let's go to his chapter and verse system. So here is his. Look what he writes over here. He writes, Aleph is Hamelech David Zaken, and Gimel is again, V'amamlocha Nacheina B'yad Shloima. So he copied the exact same thing. What's going on over here? Will become clear in a second. But before we do, I just want to point out the following. Notice there's a difference in the way the 1524 Chumash presents Sefer Malachim Aleph and the way the concordance presents Sefer Malachim Aleph. The Chumash of 1524 just says, this is called Malachim Aleph, and gives you the list of the chapters. The concordance says, this is Malachim Aleph. And by the way, for Christians, this is what? 3rd Kings, right? Because the Cheshbon. So what's happening over here? And this is a very, very important point. At no point did Yaakov ben Chaim say that the prakim come from Christians. It never came. He said he used the concordance. He never said it came from Christians. He did say it's. I used what he used in the concordance, and I would have preferred if I would have had what the Balei Amasaira. But identifying the chapters as coming from Christians, he never said once. And therefore, you could be a Yid who bought this Mikrois Gedolah. It wasn't called Mikrois Gedolah then, but who bought this Chumash in 1524. And you had it on your shelf and you open it, you would have no clue where these chapters will come from unless you did the research. But on the face, you would not have that information. Here's an expression of that, because he just calls them Malachim Aleph. And our friend who has the biblical concordance says, oh, by the way, it's Malachim Aleph, and in the Christian system, it's the 3rd book. It's the 3rd book of Kings, and that's an important difference to note. Okay, so what's going on over here? How come we have a Perek that's labeled wrong? So the answer is, not that you should look, but if you were to look at the Vulgate, at the Roman translation of the Bible, you will see that chapter 3 begins, and the kingdom was established in the hand of Shlomo, and he made affinity with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. In other words, he had the way the Roman Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, he decided that the pasuk should begin at a different place. And so that's why when Christians made chapters, they obviously began it. The chapter began at that place. And remember, the concordance was following the Christian model. So Kamuvani followed that model. And so now Yaakov ben Chaim followed that model as well. Okay, eventually in later prints they changed it. They realized, no, it's okay to use our system, but we're not going to have Perek Gimel start in the middle of a pasuk. So eventually it was changed. These are small areas of where you see the difficulty, so to speak, that came along with adopting this model. Now, the word Rabbanim were very upset about that this happened. I already showed you before the printer in the early 1800s in Frankfurt, who said this is a terrible thing. He used a lashon chulin, came into Kodesh. Now we know exactly what happened. Why? Because once the 1524 Tanach had the prakim, this was used by almost every printing of the Chumash thereafter. It was used, and then we saw the culmination of it was 100 or so years later in the 1650s when Rabbi Yosef Atiyas even made a siman at the end of it to say, oh, by the way, not only I'm using the chapters, but I'm even giving a siman to it. So this became so standard. And so in the early 1800s, Heidenheim said, hey, this is terrible. What are we going to do about it? But well, no one did anything about it. In the early 1900s, here's an example of a sefer that was written by a Yid in Vilna. His name was Pesach Finfer. And he wrote a sefer, and he does a lot about Tanach in the sefer. One of the things that he tries doing in the sefer is to say, he give the history of how the prakim developed, and he wants to make a macha, and he wants to say that we should stop using that system, and he wants that we should come up with an alternative system that's inherently Jewish. And he has haskamis from various rabbanim. One of the rabbanim that he has is the Reb Eliyahu David Rabinovitz, who was known as the Aderes. He's a shver of Rabbi Kook, and in this haskama, the Adaras writes, B'dvar Rishimas Kapitlin, I'm reading number 11, about the chapters, Kamayu Kamani, I agree with you. Ma'oi Dov Alibi Alzeh, it hurts me, it pains my heart. Ubavada mitzvah g'dayla l'shanis, if only we could change it. Last is Yunah b'mkaymes haruim b'emes, if we can make the breaks in places that are actually appropriate. But Paul, it's a uphill battle, and no one has really been able to do anything of this sort. Though there's a few voices that I wanted to make a change, nothing has really happened in this regard. Now, there's a few things that we need to do in order to close out. In 1958, there was an article that was written in Sinai, the journal Sinai, that was written by a scholar. His name is Reb Shmuel Hakohen Weingarten, and he wrote an essay called Chalukas HaTorah L'Prakim. And he tries to trace the history, and he does. He brings a lot of the sources that we were speaking about. He presents this in this article, and really anyone who does any work in this subject at some point is going to come back to his article, because really, in a certain sense, it got the conversation started in modern times. Okay, now one of the things he talks about there is he says, now that we establish it comes from Christians, I want to show you that it's nefarious. I want to show you that it's anti-Semitic, and I want to show you that it is Amaratzish. And he brings the following examples. Where does Bereshis chapter 2 start? It starts with Vayechul Hashemayim. Everyone knows, makes no sense. How do you start Vayechul Hashemayim? It's all about the 6 days of creation leading into Shabbos. The whole reason why you have the 6 days is to get us about Shabbos. So you put the first 6 days in chapter 1 and Shabbos in chapter 2. It makes no sense. Why? It must be. This is the Christian attempt to delegitimize Shabbos and to de-emphasize Shabbos. This is what he writes in his article. I'm sitting there, I'm reading this. I'm like, if anything, you bring it more prominence when you put it at the beginning of another chapter. Number one. Number two, I don't know so much about that religion, but I know that they have the concept of a Sabbath and that it comes from the Torah. So is it really true that he's going to be de-emphasizing this? So it never really made sense to me, but he does write this. And he brings other examples as well that are very tenuous, that are very weak in terms of his attempt to say that there's some anti-Semitic plot that is here. Well, maybe one second. Maybe one or two of them have a little more more research needs to go into them. I want to focus just on the 5 books where we have a little more yediyah in the 5 books and look at some examples that he brings. This is the main example that he brings here. I think it's a very, very weak raya. We'll come back to it in a second. Then he points out another thing. Amaratzes. What's the Amaratzes? The end of Shmois, the ending of Shmois has Moshe Rabbeinu complaining to Hashem. He's saying it got worse. The last pasuk of Parsha Moshe is Vayomer Hashem al Moshe. Now you're going to see it's all going to be good. Okay, that our Parsha ends. We have a stuma over there. Then Va'era begins. Hashem speaks. What happens if you look in our Chumash? The last pasuk in Shmois is the first pasuk of Perek Vav. Makes no sense. What do you mean? Clearly, this pasuk Vayomer Hashem al Moshe is is Hashem responding to Moshe Rabbeinu's taina. So clearly it belongs in the end, it belongs, that pasuk belongs in the previous chapter. It doesn't belong in the next one, which is a new dibur. Okay, so some Amaratzish. Here's another one. Parshas Pinchas. The beginning of Parshas Pinchas, you have Hashem is talking to, not the beginning, but somewhere into Parshas Pinchas, it says, now Hashem tells Moshe about all their commandments. It goes on. The last pasuk says, and Moshe said this all to the Yidden. So this makes sense that it should be part of the previous perek, right? Then Parshas Matos is a new thing. Now Moshe is talking to Rashi Amatis, not about karbonis, a new thing about Nedorim. So it makes a lot of sense. We have a psucha that says that the pasuk, what is perek lamed, pasuk aleph, belongs as part of the previous chapter. But look what he did. It looks like he fell asleep at the wheel. How did he forget? How did he not realize that this is Moshe Rabbeinu conveying the whole Parshas Pinchas to the Jewish people, which is one thing, and Parshas Matos is a new thing. I thought about it a little more, and I realized there's actually a tzad hashava between all three of these things. And maybe this is an interesting thing that would do more research. I didn't have the time to do this. But basically like this. It seems to be that he's making a division in his mind between Kodesh and Chol. Let's go back to Shabbos. 6 days of the week, Chol. Shabbos, Kedusha, that needs to be in a separate category. Perek Beis. Go, next example. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking. That's Chol. Hashem is talking. Vayemer Hashem Moshe. That needs to be in a new chapter. It's about the previous issue. I don't care. If God is talking, it needs to be in a new perek. You have another Vayidaber Elikim. I don't care. God talking needs to be in a new chapter. Go here. Same thing. Hashem finished talking. Now Moshe is going to talk to the Jewish people. That's in a new chapter. I don't care if it's about the same issue. There seems to be, and maybe we could look further, he seems to have this, and maybe this is not Jewish. Maybe this is not Jewish. Why? Because we know the Rambam. What does the Rambam say? Every word in Torah is equal Kedusha. Even the genealogy about a random person that was born as the same Kedusha as Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So maybe our perspective is you can't do that. But from his perspective, maybe there was divisions in Torah. There's when God's speaking, there's when humans are speaking, and so you end up having a division of Kodesh and Chol. So rather than seeing it as anti-Semitic, and rather than seeing it as Amaratzish, I think the right way to look at this is to say, he had a certain, whoever it is, we didn't discuss, by the way, who is the person who made the division of the chapter. It doesn't concern me so much, and you can Google that on your own and figure it out. It's not so negea for our purposes, but whoever it was, he had a shittah. And it seems like there was some thought that went into this. Maybe we disagree with it, but at least in these examples, I don't see evidence for anti-Semitism, and I don't see evidence of Amaratzis. Now, we need to close it out with one thing that's left hanging. That is, I showed you earlier, that the Rebbe makes a whole Torah out of Yutes and Chaf. Perek Yutes, Pasuk Chaf. Perek Chaf, Pasuk Yutes. Well, guess what? It's not the only time the Rebbe did this. In another place, the Rebbe speaks about Parshas Ha'azinu. And in Parshas Ha'azinu is chapter 32 of Devarim. Says the Rebbe, it's not an accident. Why? Because Parshas Ha'azinu is the lave of the whole Sefer Devarim. And in fact, it's the lave of the whole Torah. Why? Because Parshas Ha'azinu is a Shira. And you have all of the very important messages that are embedded. And so therefore it's a lave. Just like the lave, the heart, it gives life to the whole body. So too, Parshas Ha'azinu, the Shira of Ha'azinu, gives life to the whole Torah. That whole diuk rests on what? The fact that it's chapter 32. So here you see there's another example of where the Rebbe is doing this. And then you come to what maybe is the most famous one. The famous Sikha of the Rebbe about the breaking of the Luchas, Shviras HaLuchas. And you have how the Rebbe asks, how is it possible to end the Torah with the breaking of the Luchas? That's an inappropriate ending. So what does the Rebbe explain? The Rebbe explains that it brings out the gadlus of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Avos Yisrael of Moshe Rabbeinu, that as much as he loved the Torah, but he loved the Jewish people more. And because the presence of the Luchis was going to threaten the existence of the Jewish people, because it said there you can't serve idols, so then that's threatening the Jewish people. So therefore Moshe Rabbeinu comes and says, with the mashal, I'm going to tear up the ksuba, that's like no adultery happened. I'm going to tear up the Luchis, and so therefore the Jews didn't violate one of the commandments, and then the Jews could be saved. It's the Goydel Avos Yisrael of Moshe Rabbeinu, so it's the perfect ending to the Torah, Le'inei Kol Yisrael, Rashi says, is referring to the fact that he broke the Luchis, so that's the perfect ending to the Torah. And the Rebbe says, by the way, I want to point out, Vim Ayin Mecheni No Mesifrecha is very similar. Forgive the Jews, and if not, get me out of the Torah. Here again, what's happening? Moshe Rabbeinu, as much as he loves the Torah, is choosing the Jews over the Torah. Then the Rebbe says in the Ha'aron, look at the Sichis. You know what Perek it's in? Perek Lamed Beis Shmois. You know what Pasuk it's in? Pasuk Lamed Beis Shmois. Leiv. That shows the Leiv of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Ava, the love that he had for the Jewish people of Lamed Beis. The Rebbe also points out that in Maseches Berachos, the discussion happens on Daf Lamed Beis. But that's a separate thing. The Rebbe finds that significant. So here's another example where we see the Rebbe taking the chapter and verse system and not just using it for Amar Amakim. It's one thing, the Tzemach Tzedek says, by the way, look in Yeshaya, Kapitel Gimel, to look up a pasuk. Fine. Many Gedolei Yisrael do that. But to learn that it's a Torah Dika Inyan from it, the Rebbe is doing it. And here we see 3 times that the Rebbe is doing it. So there's hard in Lekutei Sichos, and the Rebbe's approach is basically as follows. He writes as follows. Yadua Hashak Levataya, I'm reading number 14. The Shakla V'Tarya is well known, but again, the discussion about this division into chapters and where it comes from is well known. Nonetheless, all books, the whole Tfutas Yisrael, and all Jews, Ugdaili Yisrael, and Gdaili Yisrael, and for many generations, it exists. And therefore, Mini Yisrael Toirehi. Mini Yisrael Toirehi. This is an amazing statement. Why? If you tell me, which the Rebbe would do very often, that because Minig Yisrael Torah is to call it Parshas Vayeshev, so therefore it means we can learn Torah from that, fine. But this, you're saying Minig Yisrael Torah for something that comes from a non-Jewish source. But for the Rebbe here, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Even though, by the way, that it's a different division. I show you, it's a different division. And here you can ask yourself, we know that the Rebbe was very upset about the shape of the luchas. Shape of the luchis needs to be in a certain way, and the non-Jews started making with rounded tops, and then it infiltrated into the Jewish system, and the Rebbe waged a war that we should stop it. So it's a good exercise question to think yourself. I'm not going to ask you for the answer now. What's the difference? There, it was a corruption of how the luchis look like. Okay, I understand that. But here, I know I'm not inventing a new pasuk, but at the end of the day, you are introducing a new division. Could we be mechalek? Yeah, make a mechalek zayin. But I want you to think on your own. How would you word the difference between the two? How would you word the difference? Would it surprise you if the Rebbe would have made a battle and said, by the way, this is terrible, let's get rid of the chapter system? I don't know, I thought about it. But what do you see? No, a different approach. We don't see this by other Rabbeim. As far as I know, we don't have any other Rabbeim doing something like this. I'm very curious about the Rebbe's father. Very curious if the Rebbe's father in his Torah did this. I have a hunch that the answer is yes. I have to look. I have to figure out how to find that. I have a hunch that he did it. I don't know. But you see, the Rebbe did it multiple times, and he applies Minig Yisrael Torah even to this type of thing. And then he refers to the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim about minhagos, that pashat b'chol Yisrael, that these are binding halachically, which is just, the Rebbe is using very interesting language here, and willing to adopt this model. And that's why Lubavitch did not join the campaign. Not that there's a significant one, but if there would be a campaign to get rid of this chapter and verse system, it doesn't look like we would sign on to that because of this approach. As far as I know, there's very few people. There are people still today who are very upset about this, and they get agitated by it, and they want to get rid of it. And there one mizman, a new sefer comes out, and a new kuntras comes out, making a macha of how terrible this is. Most people don't care and are happy to use it. Very few do what the Rebbe does, and that is to say, I'm knowing what I know, I'm still willing to say that given that it infiltrated and came in by Hashgacha Pratis and became a minig, so therefore it's part of Torah, and I'm willing to derive lessons from it. Anyway, Adkan. How Elias became broken up is a separate discussion. It's not to do with the Brooklyn.